Perhaps it's the random works of this big world, or it's due to climate change. One thing for sure is the wind this year is nothing short of strange. And that said, I'll also add that everything's entwined. How else could a bit of rough weather bring old memories back to mind? The recent storms that we've endured brought me back to my 5th grade and a take-home storytelling assignment, and what a bags of it I made. I half listened to my teacher's words, never bothered to write them down, only thought on it the night before it was due. Now, what did she say? I frowned. Oh, yes. Tell a story that my parents often tell. So I asked my father, and he sat down and he thought on it a spell. Here's one from when I was a boy, about the same as you. It's of a near disaster, and every word of it is true. And so, dutifully, I wrote it down, even added a few lines of my own. Next day at school, when the assignment came up, I realized with a groan I'd done it wrong. For a true story was not what it was supposed to be. So I kept my head down, and the teacher never called on me, thankfully. And when the class was over, I said, well, that is that for me. But our ever weirder weather somehow rekindled the long-lost memory. And now the tale that I jotted in a scribbler that I've long since thrown away is worth the time to relate to you on this not-so-windy day. My dad was, like me, a teacher, but all the Barrys before he were planters, which means they owned a bit of land, and they made their living at the sea in western boats, two-masted schooners of 30 feet or more. They went to the Cape for days at a time and returned again, full store. One fine day in August, my grandfather left to catch his fish for Lady Day. He said, the weather's fine and the fishing's good, so I won't be long away. Still, as it sometimes happens, a late summer storm from out of nowhere came, with gale force winds and driving rain. I hope they're safe, my Granny Barry did exclaim. A few boats returned that evening, much worse for the wear, but of Skipper Billy Barry's crew, well, there was no hide nor hair. They all went to the church to pray, for there wasn't any news, and they offered up the rosary for the safe return of all the crews. Now that night was long. Nobody slept, and the whole house shook and creaked, until sometime in that fearsome night the worst of it had peaked. The morning light showed some wharves wrecked, and the lighthouse it had burned, but thankfully it could be seen that most crews had returned. But not for Skipper Billy's boat, the aging Mystical Rose. Grandma sat by the window saying, well, they're in God's hands now, I suppose. Until at last she sat back up. His back was all she said. And Dad almost tripped up in his own self as down to the wharf he fled. Now, that sailing ship was a sorry sight that would fill you up with gloom. Nothing flying but the mainsail, and no sign of her Jib Boom. All hands on deck with sculling oars, and she listening to her starboard side. Still, they'd all made it back, whole brim with fish, and on to the wharf they tied. His wife met Grandad at the door. Your supper's on the heating rack. You had me worried, and you surely took your time in getting back. Still, the story was not ended, although that part went somewhat well. But later, after supper, Skipper Billy had another tale to tell. After a good day's fishing, splitting, and gutting, the hole was mostly stocked, and a rising southwest wind was driving them back home through the fog, when from out of nowhere, a big gust came and drove the boom across his rib, and as he stood back up, he saw it shred both the foresail and the jib. Now he knew that on this open bay they would not last for long, between the torn up sails, the swell, the rain, and the wind that was now so strong. But all that was near was a deserted harbor that most sailors did eschew. A rumor of an evil thing that had happened there still struck fear in every crew. The situation worsened by the hour, and the ship began to list. Still, the protestations of the frightened crew continued to persist, until at length an unfamiliar ship, an old square-rigged brigantine, drove through the Narrows and hove right to. Most unexpected scene. Now, with the harbour now not empty, the crew agreed to go. So they limped in to find shelter and dropped anchor there, although the other ship was silent and dark, with ne'er a hand on deck. Still better in this eerie place than to be assured of wreck. Skipper Billy stayed on deck at watch, but told the crew to go below. Said, "You'll need to be rested up for when we get the chance to go." But just after dark, to his surprise, he saw a fire on the beach. Strange for this abandoned place, so for his spyglass he did reach. It was indeed a bonfire, and what's more, people gathered all round it. Now he wondered how through the wind and rain it had managed to stay lit. Taking a closer look, he realized they were beckoning to him. So he made us to head into shore, for their situation appeared grim. But then, to his great surprise, the brigantine weighed anchor, and with lights aglow, situated itself between him and the beach, so he could no further go. Undaunted, he retied the main boom and tried another tack, but the bigger ship also came about and once more stopped him in his tracks. This went on for quite some time, until the worst of the storm had passed. By now exhausted, he dropped anchor and sail and tied it all full fast. Decided to sit down for a spell, for he was feeling fully spent, and the stress of the day had taken quite the toll, so right off to sleep he went. Now he woke to calm seas and the sun now shining bright. Of the brigantine and the crowd on the beach, well, there was no clue or sight. And as all hands were anxious to get home, he put it from his mind, for getting the boat back to her berth took all their strengths combined. Now the family looked at Granddad askance. "I'm telling no lies," he swore. But his aged father, Morris, stirred, saying, "It's true, and I can add some more. There's a thing I witnessed when I was young and long before my prime that I've never told my family, but now I suppose it's time." As a boy of 12, I left my home and I signed on to a brigantine. And after about a month in, we too faced a storm like the one you just have seen. We pulled into that very harbor, our sails too were tore, and we saw the fire on the beach and the people waving us ashore. We brought the ship close in as we dared, and we fired them off a line. But it turned out that their intentions were anything but benign. For instead of thanking us for saving them, once they were all aboard, they drew their weapons, and every one but me they then put to the sword. I tried to sneak for the forecastle hatch, and down below I dove. But one of them took off after me, and between us, we knocked over the stove. The ship caught fire right then and there, before you could even blink, and only I survived, as the works of it burnt up, and then did sink. Now, somehow I find my way back to Red Island, and here I did remain. And as for speaking of that incident, well, I mostly have refrained. Now, Skipper Billy at his father looked. What was it that saved me yesterday? But Morris said not another word, and there the story stayed. And now, as I am here safe in this place, awaiting the next gale, I'm reminded, after all these years, of this eerie, once-told tale, and whether there are times when our world with that of the spirits does collide, I have my opinion, but I'll leave that part for you two to decide.